Krieg Mitteleuropa und die USA haben darauf bereits reagiert. Außerdem gibt es jetzt die Meldungen, dass es in den nächsten Stunden dazu kommen könnte, dass Kiew fällt. Wie spricht man darüber in den USA?
Ja, die US-Geheimdienste, die US-Regierung hat genau davor schon seit ein paar Tagen, wenn nicht Wochen, gewarnt, dass eben möglicherweise auch große Städte wie eben Kiew ins Ziel genommen werden könnten. Natürlich hier auch der Schock groß. Hier haben wir hier in Washington viele US-Botschaften beispielsweise, weil es eben die Hauptstadt ist. Und da haben wir auch Polizei, Secret Service vor der russischen Botschaft heute gesehen. Da gab es auch Demonstranten, Protestler. Also hier natürlich sitzt der Schock auch tief. Und Biden hat jetzt eben weitere heftige Sanktionen verhängt. Da gab es sogar
the events around that meltdown of that nuclear reactor and the lies that were told and the way it was hidden, that is seen as one of the catalysts for the demise of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union that President Putin in some ways harks back to, or at least he harks back to the kind of Soviet empire, if you like. Well, Chernobyl was part of the decline of that empire. Now, of course, we're hearing that Russian troops have taken it over, so it's back in Russian hands again. You know, Hallie, I've actually been there to Chernobyl. Yeah. It is a desolate place. There, you walk into classrooms where there are still children's toys lying around. You go to houses where there are copies of Pravda, the old Soviet newspaper, just lying on the floor in dust. There is a fairground that's not been used for decades. It's a stunning place. It's safe to go to now, apart from right in the center where the reactor is, which they have encased. Quite sophisticated science. They've encased it in order to ensure that it does not cause a danger. Clearly, a firefight or worse around that particular piece of Chernobyl. Well, and by worse I mean artillery or even missiles. Well, that would be very worrying. It sounds like it is now in the hands of the Russians. In a way, that's a good thing, because it just needs to be in the hands of somebody, assuming that they know what to do with it and how to ensure that it continues to be safe. We have to assume that. But yeah, it's symbolic more than important, but still strategically tells us something about where the Russians are in the way that you mentioned.
Such a good point. Here, we're seeing you live in Moscow now. I've seen you live in Moscow since this invasion began some 16 hours ago. Can you give me a sense of what it's like on the ground? We've seen some anti-war protests there. Mike Memoli referenced that. How significant is that in your view, as somebody who well knows this area?
Yeah, it's well, they're now saying, according to an NGO, 1,700 arrests in 52 cities across Russia. Now, that sounds like a lot. I guess you could say it's not a lot in a country of almost 150 million people with multiple time zones. But the pictures are impressive, compelling, and maybe sending a message. Certainly the protesters will want to be sending a message. And by the way, any protests in Russia have a certain kind of impact, because everybody knows the work that has been done to crush any opposition, including, of course, Alexei Navalny, who continues to be in a prison in Russia, and actually just before this conflict started was back in court facing a potential extension of his prison sentence of 15 years. So yeah, protests, sending a message to President Putin. Question is President Putin listening? I suspect not.
That's right. Keir Simmons, live for us there in Moscow. Keir, thank you very much for being up for us. We're going to keep talking about what's going on with this Ukrainian crisis, but we have news just into us, literally in the last 5 minutes, breaking here at home. And it involves that jury in St. Paul, Minnesota, finding 3 former Minneapolis police officers guilty of violating George Floyd's civil rights. This is a trial we had been watching. Prosecutors have said that Alexander King, Thomas Lane, and Tu Tao, who were all at the scene when former officer Derek Chauvin pressed his knee into Floyd's neck, killing him, chose to do nothing. The defense had said the officers were not trained properly to intervene, claimed they did try to help. I want to bring in now, who is live in St. Paul, Shaq Brewster, here for us for NBC News. Shaq, I know this has just all developed. This verdict was just read out. Bring us up to speed.
Yeah, Hallie, this jury took about 13 hours over the course of 2 days to reach this unanimous verdict. You read it. They are guilty. The three former officers who were at the scene as Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, they were found guilty of deprivation of rights under the color of law. These are federal charges, Hallie, and it's that weird term that you hear, deprivation of rights under the color of law. What prosecutors are essentially arguing is that for all three of the officers, they deprived George Floyd of his civil rights by not providing medical aid as he was clearly lying on the ground in need of that medical attention. For two of the officers, Tu Tao and Alexander King, they faced that additional charge and have now been convicted of that additional charge of failing to intervene as Derek Chauvin was using that excessive force. That just happening in the past couple of minutes. The jury also unanimously saying that the officers' inaction here led to George Floyd's death. That becomes important in sentencing. Now, how much time these officers are now facing in prison for this conviction, well, that's not specifically clear at this point. Federal prosecutors say there's a complicated formula that goes into this, but they estimate they'll be facing about 2 to 4 years in prison for this. It's important to note, Hallie, that all three of these former officers also are facing state charges for aiding and abetting the murder of George Floyd. So they're not out of the clear just yet. But the big news right now is that a jury of 8 women and 4 men have now convicted all 3 officers who were at the scene as George Floyd was murdered, have convicted them of depriving George Floyd of his civil rights.
I think that second trial set to start in June. Shaq, themes of the case, big picture here, seem to revolve around whether these defendants, now convicted, felt they could speak up to authority and essentially pull in, the bad behavior of colleagues.
That's exactly right. And if you remember that original video as George Floyd was being murdered, there was Tu Tao, who was the officer who was trying to control the crowd. He testified. All 3 of these officers testified in their own defense. Tu Tao testifying that he was trying to focus his attention on the crowd and wasn't aware of what was happening behind the car, wasn't aware of the medical aid that George Floyd needed. There was Alexander King, who was standing next or kneeling next to Derek Chauvin. He was arguing that Chauvin was his training officer, and he didn't know how, or he trusted Chauvin and didn't realize, he says, that his duty was to intervene. He says, he testified on the stand that Minneapolis Police Department failed him and didn't tell him exactly how to intervene. He was actually at Floyd's legs. And then there was Thomas Lane, and he was one who, if you watch that video or remember the initial trial, he suggested to Chauvin, should we roll